Okay, so test lists. Once you've got your test, really, I should clarify this too. When we've been running these tests, just to pull one of these back up here, when we've been running these tests from here and executing, we've been getting results. But those are all temporary results that we've been looking at. When you execute from this sort of test tab, you're in a design mode and you're getting a design mode execution, okay? Sort of a one-off run. But when you put a test in a test list, it'll start to generate real results and real reports. Now, test lists can either be dynamic or static. You can basically open up, create a list, whatever you want, go grab the tests you want, put them in the order that you need. In a static list, it's going to stay this way unless I go in and change something, okay? In a dynamic list, you can set up rules that will continue to maintain your list. And I'll show you an example here of the staging login test list that has 43 tests in it. And it's because it's rules driven. This continues to maintain itself. Anytime a test is added with the word login in its name, it's automatically scooped up by this dynamic test list. So that includes even the ones I've been making earlier already in here. You've got different properties, custom properties, and this actually goes back, you may have remembered when I was showing you the properties panel, the test level properties have some property fields that you can use for whichever you like, and I just so happen to have a test list called tests with bugs. And for this, I find the custom property field that contains the word bug because I've been keeping track of the bug number with the tests associated with the tests. And that gives me a test list that's ready to fire that has associations to different bugs. Okay. And so this is the dynamic list. Now I took this login test list that has 43 tests in it. Right, very basic rule, but you can have multiple rules. You can do all sorts of things here. And of course you have your column level filters, so you can even filter your tests, more test lists. But I took that test list and I made a copy of it. So here's the copy of it. These have the exact same tests in them. 43 tests, 43 tests. This is not a total of 86 tests. These are 43 total tests that are being used in different lists. They're the same exact test files. The reason I have them in two different lists is that one of these has the test list settings pointed at my local host environment. So this is one of the first things we talked about was the base URL. Here's where the base URL comes back and pays you dividends. When you preset your tests to project with the base URL, and of course you can always modify this easily along the way, but ideally if you set it ahead of time in your project settings, you record your tests against that environment, and you've accumulated a list of tests, you put them in the list, and you want them to be ready to fire against the next server that it's going to be on. QA2, QA3, whatever, you swap out the base URL. It will append whatever you put in here with the navigate URL at runtime. This is also where you'll specify what browsers you want to execute against, all 5 if you prefer, and all sorts of settings for timing, element wait timeout, how long to execute commands, should there be an execution delay. I will tell you this one setting right here is a lifesaver. If you have a slow server environment, you can simply add 500 milliseconds as an execution delay. And let's say I've got a list of 200 tests. I add 500 milliseconds here, and it will add half a second between each test step of each test on each browser on each machine. So this one setting change here at the list level can be really, really powerful. Same with the base URL, same with all these other settings of how you want things handled. So you can put them in the list, great settings around how those lists are maintained. So I made a copy of that list. The other copy of that list, staging one, its base URL is pointed to the staging server. So I have 2 lists that are going to continue to grow, right? These are not dead lists. These are dynamic lists. So as more tests are added that meet the criteria, these lists will both identically continue to grow, and I have 2 lists that are identical, ready to fire against their particular environments at any moment's notice. Okay, that's the test list boogie there, I guess. And then we have scheduling of test lists. So once you get a list, you can configure your scheduling. There are lots of documents on this. By the way, you might always see this little number up here. I think this might be a nice way for us to get to some documentation. It shows us we've been in new territory, and there's maybe some new documentation around. I was hoping for one that talks about scheduling. Oh, here's one. Scheduling test runs. I'll drop this in. This is not necessarily installed out of the box by default. This is also where I'll put in shameless plugs for Runtimes. Runtimes are the Swiss Army knife of TestStudio. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to go get some so you can build out a lab of machines and really get a lot more result data out of that as well. Whoops, clicked the wrong one there. Okay. But the scheduling and test lists, once you've got that stuff configured, you can set up a recurring schedule, hourly, weekly, monthly, daily, minutely, or minutely, depending on your pronunciation of that word. You can then choose, since you've got runtimes out there, you can choose multiple machines that could be executing these simultaneously. Or maybe we are still going to be busy on this box. We'll have these other two execute for us while we're busy over here. Oh, and get the latest version out of TFS while you're at it, right? On the last step here, this is where you can enable email notification to multiple people, and you have 5 now different options to include attachments for result data, including our new HTML and XML versions of that. It's a beautiful thing. All right, so set it, forget it. Oh, by the way, in that you can even tell it, don't even send me an email unless there's a failure. So you could go the no news is good news route, or you can say, hey, send me the details every time. Okay, so that allows you to schedule the list. Once your lists are running, whether you're running them from Run List Now, or whether you're, in fact, let's go ahead and run list remotely. We'll do wheel and dash lap and OSDemo PC. We'll keep working on this one, and it's going to send that over to those machines. And it will take us over here to the results view. Also, if we jump back to the project window and status, you can see that there's a list running. The Amazon Test Guide login test is running on that machine. And actually, if I look back at that machine, looks like there's a browser starting to spin up. So we have work that can continue. This is another beautiful part of Runtimes. I have machines executing test lists that I've just repaired to see if that repair holds while I'm continuing on to the next thing. So it can run all of the tests in the list against 5 different browsers and come back and let me know how things went. All right, so that's test list. Now on to results. So results, I don't know how good these results are in here. These lists are not that awesome, a lot of failure. But here's the result data. This is our proprietary AII result file. From here too, you can export to HTML, XML, Word, Excel via Visual Studio result file. Let's do the HTML one real quick since this is one of our new formats. I like this too because the email button I'll show you next allows you to email it straight out. But here's your result file now. This is cool. It's brand new HTML-based result data that lets you expand and retract and see float over, a couple missing images, forgive me for that, but expected versus actual. We've got the failure detail that we can drill into. Again, the screenshots built into that. It just makes it real easy to see, where the failing steps were and the screenshots of that failure at the point of failure. So lots of data there. Also from the email, this is kind of a new feature. We had the automated email, but we added in the sort of this manual email. You pick your poison and hit go, and it will allow you to send that out directly from here. or you could have it delivered automatically as part of the scheduler. You can also, of course, publish back to TFS build server, things like that. But over here, we can drill down. We can see this was an 0 for 7. Let's drill down into it. There's actually some things that passed here. There's an if-else login at the beginning. There was a failure in there. Let's double-click into that. There was a failure on step 2 here. And we can go in and we can see there was a failure to locate an element. So from here, I'm going through, and this is the Monday morning quarterback. We've had this test list run overnight or on the weekends. I'm coming in and I'm looking at the result data. I'm drilling down to failure. I'm going to now determine if this is something I could fix myself or something I need help with. And I'm going to just submit that to bug tracking system if it's a bug, or I'm going to export it or email it or do whatever I need to do with it to move the ball along, essentially. So that one's done. I'll go to the next one. We'll back up to the test list here. Let's see, we'll look at this 2 out of 10 maybe. So this got through the navigate, it went through the desktop click, and then it failed on this verification, image verification. It was 122.93% difference. Remember that an image verification could be more than 100% different because it could be twice as big, for instance. Images, in this case, definitely different. Page DOM, all that stuff, and again, submit, export, whatever you need to do. So that's failure data and result data there. Oh, I almost forgot the graphical view that's here too, and the ability to add notes along the way. Save those comments. That way, if you have the same kind of failure recur, you might leave yourself some notes to review that later. And then the new reports tab. Something I used to be shy about showing, but certainly am impressed with what the team has put together for us. And this is really the first wave of the new reporting. It's definitely a big step forward for us, as far as reporting goes, once we get some data up here. But basically you have the ability to look at more of the graphical kind of view. You can choose which test lists you want to, and really which results of those test lists you want to view and enable in the graphs. You get an overall health up here as far as pass, fail, and not run. You've got result details down here that you can drill into as well and see the failing test steps, or in this case the failing test. Right, and then we could go not run, failed, pass. We can filter those down further. We have data labels we could throw in here. We have different kind of charts that we can use too. I don't know if that one computes well, but lots of different variations. And this is just all of the lists I've run for this project so far. I can eliminate some of these and maybe just look at one list. Maybe we'll do list 1 here since it has the most data. And we can see trend over time. Not a great trend. In fact, this project has a whole lot of failure in it, but we like to talk about becoming a genius by failure. So we're on the right path. But basically my hope is that as I continue, I'll get more and more green out of these. And of course, being a demo expert and trainer, I show people how to deal with failures a lot, so you won't find a lot of success in my projects. They don't train as easily on tests that pass. So anyways, you can also export an HTML and image from here too. So how do we begin with performance testing? We begin with a functional test. So here's our basic login. You open that up, you click performance. If it's the first time you ever run it as a performance test, you will be prompted to configure that performance test, which I'll take you through while it's loading some data. And part of performance testing is the ability here to add computers. Not just one, but potentially multiple computers. This allows you to monitor and inspect how a process plays out from the app server's perspective, from the execution agent or end user's perspective, from the database server's perspective. So performance profiling means we're opening up a machine, we're tapping into a machine that has a TestStudio license on it, and we're accessing the profiler so that we can see the metric level data of that machine. Things like physical disk, memory, how are those affected? Where are the bottlenecks? Processor, stuff like that in our process. So you add computer, you connect into it. Now you do need to mention, you do need to have a TestStudio license on it. That does not mean a full license. In fact, in a lot of these scenarios, you'll see, I believe it's this one here, where I have a runtime sitting on the app server that's only job is to performance monitor. I actually don't want it executing on the app server. That would be like having my users actually log on to the machine that's hosting it. So I just have it there to monitor, and that monitoring comes back into TestStudio. These other runtimes that are executing can also be monitored simultaneously. Runtimes can also be scheduling and storage servers. There's just so many things they can do, and they're super cheap. So go get some runtimes. But once you've got a runtime on there, you've got the ports open for it, you can tap in and get to all of those performance counters. You can build out a template of what you want. You can save that template, load that template later. Basically, that relates to all those little metrics that make sense to monitoring. We'll see some of those here in a moment. Here's our history data. I've run this test multiple times as a performance test. I've got some different interesting variations. Here's a 28-second one, and here's a 3-second one. Now, I do want to run a performance test at peak load, at average load, and at no load, so I get a baseline and I get some other metrics to kind of benchmarks to measure against. Speaking of benchmarks, we can set one of these as a benchmark by just toggling it there to compare against. And when we have more than one result, we can do a comparison, which we'll do in a minute. But on the history, we see each individual run. We can delete outliers if we need to. We also see a trend line over time of how the overall performance of the test has carried out. On the Overview tab, we see an individual run, and we see the step level kind of data. The navigate step and the server and client side timing for that, the size and errors that may have occurred to, the login step, the username, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing more and more definition in the timing here. And then if we drill down further into the test level, we'll see the method level, the test step level. Here we're seeing method level data, order of operations. We're seeing what happened and when, and how long it took to complete each piece of the process involved. We're looking for the outliers, the things that stick out here, or the things that the bottlenecks, I should say, that stick out here that show us that there's something that we need to pay attention to. Now this is fractional, right? Half a second of time. It's a 200 code, so that's pretty good. But it's something that I want to see how this is exacerbated at average load, at peak load, so forth. Okay. Now on top of this, I can plot my performance metric data that I've captured. So we'll say percent processor time, and now I can scroll down through all these different methods and see what was it that led up to a certain spike occurring in that processor percent time. Or a map physical disk. You can map them all over this. It does get a little bit cluttered if you just select them all. But we've got some good docs on this too as far as what you might want to pinpoint. It is good to pinpoint the metrics as best as possible. So let me provide you with another link called Profiling Your App. And I won't bore you with going through all that, but it talks about the metrics and so forth. Also, while we're there, there's another one called Load Strategies, which we're going to go talk about next. So I might as well prepare you ahead of time. Okay, back in TestStudio, we turn all those off. So that's our method level data. This is the micro vantage point that the performance testing gives you, locating the bottlenecks of a process. When we run this test, I guess we should give it a quick run. When you run a performance test, it runs just like a functional test. It's just going to bring back different data for you. It's not as concerned with pass and fail. It will let you know if something passes or fails. But if it fails, you're going back to the functional test to deal with that failure. and then come back to the performance test when you're ready. So there's a new record. Back over on history, we've added another one in there. It's a 5-second. Oh, and I shouldn't leave this without showing you compare, where we can take them and put them up side by side and see how they compare and where the outliers are. We can also give it some variation here. Say we can allow for a certain threshold of server and client time, data size variation. And it looks like that actually cleared all my red X's. So there's nothing that really stands out with those two. However, I could also compare this one to one of these other ones. Okay, so that's really performance testing in a nutshell. Next up, load testing. So the beauty of performance testing and load testing is you can use the same tests that you use for functional testing to also do performance and load testing. This gives you more mileage out of those tests, but then it also gives you more data points. The same test that tells you whether your application is working correctly or whether there's regressions in your application is the same test that tells you how long it takes or where the bottlenecks are in the application. Is the same test that you can then add capacities to or test the capacity of the application with it inside of load testing. So let me go ahead and open up a load test. And in this load test, when we get into load testing, we oftentimes I'll push back all these tabs because you don't really need those in the load test. Load test is just using a lot of things that you've already spent the time to prepare and kind of bringing them together. So first of all, we'll start in design. This is where we'll typically start with a load test. And a load test kind of has these 4 quadrants to it. We have the traffic, the user profiles as they're called, or user scenarios, the workload attributed to each of those. We can edit the traffic, we'll be looking into that. Some user identities if we're doing Windows authentication. And then we've also got really disbursement of multiple scenarios that are occurring simultaneously. So some people are registering, some people are logging in, some people are updating data, some people are doing nothing. It's just a mix of events, a mix of users, and potentially a mix of endpoints too that you're representing, whether that's geographic distribution or maybe device distribution. All of this comes from capturing traffic. And we want to capture traffic from different places. Now, as a comment that performance and load testing are sometimes thought to be the same. And that's true. There are very much, they're tied together. In fact, I would encourage you to do performance and load testing simultaneously. But the difference here is that the performance test gives us that micro vantage point. The load test gives us the macro vantage point. And having both of those is important. So a lot of times I will have a load test creating load. As you remember, I said I like to run my performance tests at no load, at peak load, at average load. So I'll have a load test that's generating load on my system, and then my performance test hitting it at the same time. That way we really get both measures of the individual user and bottlenecks in the processes as well as overall capacity. All right, so capturing traffic. We can capture traffic from a number of different places, 5 different ways in which you can capture traffic. From an existing web test being one of them, you grab the test, you pick the browser, it executes, it comes back with the traffic. We'll look at that in a moment. Another option, capture new traffic. You pick the browser, you go crazy. The nice thing about capturing from an existing web test is it's uniform. It's again leveraging that same test that you're familiar with, executing something that's clean and uniform and may have some really cool functionality built into it. Now typically data-driven tests, you want to capture them without their data and then add their data in. I'll show you what that looks like. But that's one option. When you capture new, it's not going to be uniform necessarily. You might run into some noise. It's just not as predictable, I guess, but that's okay too. A lot of times it's good to just go turn on a browser and go through a scenario and just capture it. So this is just doing the same thing manually. You don't have to have it coming from a web test. And then you can capture API traffic down here. You can also capture mobile device traffic down here. So 4 different options there. There's a 5th option that allows you to import your traffic from Fiddler. Fiddler, very popular web debugging tool that can capture HTTP traffic and HTTPS traffic too, and could basically capture that for you and gives you a little bit more advanced capabilities. It's a free product too. It's more of a developer tool and very popular. So if you want, you can capture traffic from that and then import them in there. Either way you go, you get them in here. What the traffic looks like, if we just look at this one little test, this is the one that we've been playing around with all day. There's my traffic. It's the get requests and response here that we've been capturing. We capture think time. This is time spent on the page, and this is so that you can vary up the virtual users that are going to execute this with some variation. So plus or minus 5 seconds, or 10 seconds plus or minus 5 is what the virtual users will do. So think time is time that they spend on the page. So they navigate and then they stop. And they tap their foot for 5 seconds or 15 seconds or 12 seconds or whatever, somewhere between 15 and 5 with these particular settings. That gives us more randomization. So the virtual users don't just act like robots. They're more randomized. They are more human-like. You can, of course, eliminate think time if you want them to be more like robots. On the post operation, this is where we would data drive something. So if we wanted to data drive a load scenario of logging into a CRM application like this, we would first capture one single iteration, as I have here. That means one set of gets and posts and stuff. And actually, it looks like I have an extra set that I've already disabled. So there was 2 iterations. This was a no-no. You can see the data here is different. So I need to unhinge that data. Of course, you can clean it up very easily just like this. But you capture one clean iteration, and then you attach data to the load test. So that's done in the project panel. And that data carries over into the post operations drop-down field. So basically the same operation of binding a test, but you're just binding the load test, not the individual test here. You bind it to the load test. And inside the individual user profile on those post operations, when there's data available, you'll see that those give you the drop-downs and the access to those column names. Okay, so that's data driving a load scenario. Okay, so we bring in those scenarios. You've also got, I should show you, dynamic targets. These are detected during execution, during a capture mode. They're session IDs. General rule of thumb is you want to turn them on because these are dynamically generated at runtime. And for an authentication token, that might not be valid for the next user at all, or it might be expired. It might not be useful for anybody but the user at hand. So I don't want to reuse somebody else's authentication token. I want to make sure that each user gets their own. And by turning these on, by checking the checkbox, this makes them dynamic, which you can see here in that post operation. They correspondingly are set to from step 0, which means at step 0 it obtains the authentication token, which is fed back in to step 2, and that's being done dynamically. Alternatively, I can go back to static, which is the value captured, or I can inject something from a data source. Okay? That is important. Session IDs are important because that's what shakes hands correctly with the application under test. I've had customers say, well, we run this load test and we don't see records showing up in the database. Well, that's probably because they're not. For some reason, the handshake is not working between the load test and the application. It might be stabbing with traffic, but it's not completing a process like a user. And so that's indicative of the session ID not being enabled or dynamic. Okay, so we've got scenarios, we've got workloads. These percentages are the breakdown of the total number of concurrent users, and it's concurrent. How many users simultaneously we want on the application. So I'll take, if I had 100 of these, I'm basically saying I want 23 of them on this register, I want 6 of them on this registration, 28 of them on quantum login, and so on. I am going to skip the execution of this because we're going to jump into mobile. But you have strategy. I gave you a link to the strategy page. The strategy talks about whether you ramp or go flat. You do a soak test for a long period of time with a constant level of load to see how it handles things, or whether you do like a stress test, constant increase of load over time to see where it breaks. You have a lot of options. I like to ramp and then plateau. Run that for 3 minutes. Over here we've got performance monitoring. So just like we had in the performance testing, in fact the same templates and things carry over. Apparently not that machine. But this gives me access to all those performance counters. Same thing that we saw in performance testing. Except over here on the Run tab now, you can take those performance counters and create your goals. So load tests, what is a passing load test? Well, passing load test for TestStudio is a load test that passes each and every one of the goals of the load test. And the goals of the load test, oftentimes there's one goal that most people think about from a load test, which is how many users can we handle? I call it the big boss number. The big boss says we have to be able to handle 10,000 users. I don't know how many times I've heard big bosses say 10,000 users, but it's kind of hilarious that it's always that particular number, it seems like. That's great. Okay, we can jam 10,000 users on there, right? But how comfortable are they going to be? What's the user experience going to be like? How many of them are going to get errors, right? How many responses received per second are we going to get? What's our average response time going to be? Is it going to be 13-second average response time to load the pages? Because we're not going to keep 10,000 users on very long if that's the case. We might not have 10,000 users total after that. So it's these other questions, these other goals that we need to answer that give us the idea of how close to the edge of the cliff are we. Now, how many users can we handle? Can we handle 10,000 users or not? That's a yes-no question. That's an on-off switch. And in fact, at 10,000 users, we either see the server on or off, right? It's either failed or it's still keeping up. But the other stuff tells us more about the user experience. And so it's important to have those goals in there. The first 4 goals are built in. They're overall test goals, meaning we are going to hit multiple machines with this load test, and we want the average of those to come together and equal or be less than or greater than or whatever the goal says about that. Then you can use custom goals too and say we want to pass or fail if either the overall test or a specific machine specific performance counter that we've enabled has more than 15 writes per second or something like that. Okay, so that's just something I'm stabbing in the dark there, but you can, if you don't know your goals, turn on your performance monitoring, choose what you want to monitor, run the load test, and then you'll have data points after you run it once. Then you'll start to kind of really hone in on these, really shape the goals and see what data points you get. Okay, so set your goals, and then that way you don't have to crunch the numbers. TestStudio can do it all for you. You can say, all right, if it's sub 3 second, we get less than 5 errors per second, we get more than 50 responses received per second, when we get to our ultimate 10,000 user level that the big boss wants to get, then and only then are we satisfied enough to say that the load test has passed. And I threw in a couple other ones down here too. The results, the execution. You can watch it execute, but basically the data that comes out, we can look at all sorts of different data. I'm just going to give you a quick subset here. You don't have to watch it live, but it is kind of fun to watch a load test if you haven't seen one, because you see it plot each set of data points. And this is a sampling rate of every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds during the life of this test, it's grabbing data. This was a time, the last time I ran this, where I thought I was about to break the server. And I was so excited. I used to have an application I could predictably break, and I'm trying to, I broke it. I haven't been able to fix it. But it's good to show an application crashing during a load test. I thought I almost had this one crashing because this giant spike in average response time. But ultimately, that giant spike in the scheme of things is not that big. It's like 5 seconds. But ultimately, we had a very low average response time. Other than that, responses received per second was okay. Errors per second was flat, which was perfect. And here you can see the growth phase and the plateau phase of my load strategy that I used. And great information, right? Graphing for overall metrics, overall test metrics here. Individual machine metrics there. We can even go to multiple results and overlay these on top of each other and compare. In this case, we had 75 versus 65. We had a very small. This is maybe important information because I'm seeing a pretty good increase in average response time with just 10 virtual users different. Right. Also an increase there of, well, of course, the virtual users, but still no errors that have occurred in that case, right? But you can see the spikes here. There was an initial spike in average response time, and then it stayed really low versus this other one that was pretty low and then had some giant spikes that occurred there. So some interesting data points. You have the overall kind of view too. This shows us that our test failed. Only 2 out of the 5 goals passed. Here's some of the dashboard view stuff. On the goals tab, we can see the errors per second and the average and the virtual users were the ones that passed. The others were the failed ones. And page-specific metrics will show us any errors that have occurred and the count and the average response time. Last but not least, on load tests, a couple things, I guess. Virtual user packs are important. You can get those from us. You also get 100 virtual users with each Ultimate license. I have 10 Ultimate licenses, so I have 1,000 virtual users. They are stackable, and you can allocate them across multiple scheduling servers. But basically, you pull together your virtual users. You can easily allocate them out. It's just a very easy to manage situation there. But we have some customers that are testing in the hundreds of thousands of virtual users. So you can also export this data into Excel or HTML format. I won't do it right now. I'll spare you of that. But it's a lot of very gross raw data. You can crunch the numbers yourself. Happy to do that if you want to. But it's typically not needed since the goals can do that stuff for you. And that is where we're going to leave load testing for now.